next book I'm going to show you is based on her family. Like I said, many of her family's family traditions and stuff are portrayed in her books. But this is called Betty Doll. This is a story about a doll that she found that was her mother's. And after her mother passed away, she found this doll, and attached to the doll in a box was a letter from her mother. And her mother explains how this doll was so important to her and all the things that it saw in her lifetime. And she passed the doll on to Patricia. So it talks about how the doll made it through the fire, and how one time they got trapped in a snowstorm. And if you can see, just the doll is colored. How they got trapped in a snowstorm and on their way home from school, and they decided to go under a bridge. And she drops Betty Doll. And the only way that they were found was that the father saw Betty Doll in the snowbank. And they were brought to safety. Again, the only color on the page is Betty Doll. She talks about how the doll went visiting and how she found fabric in a drawer and cut up the fabric, and the aunt was upset, but then the aunt decided, you know what, there's enough fabric here, and she made Patricia's mother a dress and her a dress. She talks about how the doll sat on the shelf and was there for a lot of family events and watched the kids grow up. And so she said the doll would be now Patricia's, and Patricia could pass the doll on to her children, and it would watch all the wonderful things in her house and the traditions, and she could pass it on to her children. Again, like I mentioned, the pictures in the book are real photographs that about the people she has mentioned in the story. So this is a great book to talk about special dolls, special heirlooms in children's families. The Keeping Quilt is another book by Patricia Polacco, and again, in this book, only the fabric is colored in. And this is a story about a quilt and how it is part of their family's history, and how each piece of the quilt was from somebody's clothing, and how it was at weddings and wrapped new babies that were born, and it was passed from generation to generation. It was there at the grandmother's 98th birthday party, and how the quilt will be passed on to Patricia and her family. And then you see a picture of actually Patricia and Enzo and her baby daughter, Trisha, and how it will be passed on from generation to generation. This is a great story just to talk about family traditions, celebrations, weddings, babies. And my kids were inspired in my classroom to write stories just like Patricia Polacco. They were given swaps of fabric, and they wrote stories about their pictures. So in this story, a little boy wrote about a baseball game. This one is about a dog. And they just had one scrap of fabric, and that's the only color on each page. And this one is about birds and baby birds. And this one was a story about a magic pencil. So that was really fun. Her artwork can be very inspiring too. If you go on the website or check your school library or local library, you can sometimes find videos about the books, and Patricia Polacco actually read The Keeping Quilt. And at the end of it, it shows a picture of her husband and her children. So it's kind of interesting too. It's fun to hear Patricia read the story in her own words. This is another story called Chicken Sunday. It is a story about her best friend and his family. She loved to spend time over there. And again, it explains family traditions and celebrations. This is a story about Miss Eula. They loved Miss Eula. And they would go over to Stuart's house, and Miss Eula was the grandma. And they loved her because she made these wonderful meals, chicken on Sunday. And she talked about her family and her traditions. And they would go to church with Miss Eula. And on their way to church, she would pass by the local store. And she would see some beautiful, beautiful bonnets in the store. And one day, the kids got blamed for damaging one of the local store owner shops by throwing eggs on his building. And it wasn't them, it was some other kids. But Miss Eula said, you know what, you need to show them that you have kindness and goodness in your heart. So the kids thought about what they could do, and so they decided that they would paint eggs for the shop owner. So they painted these beautiful Pinseki, I hope I'm saying that right, Pinseki eggs, and they brought them to him. And he was very touched because it reminded him of his home. And so he sat down and told the children about his childhood. And they became friends. The children worked in the store and sold the eggs to help repay the damage. At the end, though, he gave the children the money, and he also gave them the beautiful Easter bonnet that Miss Eula looked at, and they were able to give it to her on Chicken Sunday. And there she is, and there they are at church, all happy. And there's Stuart. So this was based on her best friends and his family. And helping others is kind of a nice message in that story. Apollomundo's Dream is a wonderful story. It talks about how dreams are important, and we should be able to express ourselves in any way. Apollomundo dreams, and when he dreams, his pictures end up on buildings if it is raining or wet out. And the townspeople aren't happy when these pictures appear on their buildings, and so the kids are in trouble, and they end up talking and wandering off, and they get lost, and they don't know how to find their way home, and so they think of a way that they can be saved. And they say, Apollomundo, dream your dreams, so they'll end up in the sky, and they will know where to find us. And so Apollomundo tries and tries, and he does. And he sends a message, and they are found. So this story just really talks about having dreams, and that everybody has dreams and should be allowed to express them in his or her own way. Reading Rainbow had a special, and that was kind of fun to hear this illustrated. And at the end of it, it showed different ways to create art. My classroom had a chance to use watercolors like Patricia Polacco, and they made their own spring dreams. And then they were encouraged to write about their pictures too. In Enzo's Splendid Garden, here's Enzo, which is Patricia Polacco's husband. This is kind of a funny story. It has lots of rhymes, and it kind of reminded me of the little old lady who swallowed a fly because it keeps repeating itself. And as the day goes on, one thing leads to another. The waiter trips, and it just keeps repeating itself. And the day goes from bad to worse, and there's a picture of Enzo. And pretty soon, the whole garden and everybody in it is a mess. And what caused this mess? It was all because a little old boy was reading, and he dropped his book. And he was reading a book about bees, and he had stopped to look at a bee. So this is just kind of a fun story. And it's kind of fun to find the rhymes with the class, too. Like I said, Patricia Polacco said her stories came from her experiences. And here's a time she talked about when her cousins would get together and they would have fun in the summer. And it talks about family gatherings and how they were excited to see one another. And that they had a big potluck and everybody brought stuff and they shared. They shared food and stories. The grandparents and aunts and uncles would share their stories about their childhood. And they'd play games, ride horses, and catch fireflies. And then, when it got dark, all the kids would go out and catch fireflies. So this was a wonderful story about family traditions and fun with cousins. It'd be a great way to get kids to talk about holidays and the times they've had with their cousins and aunts and uncles. One thing I did with my class is I looked at each book and we talked about the title, characters, plot, setting. We tried to find out if there was any lessons and if the lessons repeated themselves. We also looked at wow words. Patricia uses a lot of rich vocabulary, and we picked out favorite words and used them in our writing too. We also talked about her leads. She starts her stories off in such creative and interesting ways that just pull you in. These books are great for first grade just because I think they kind of kept it pretty lighthearted, and my first grade students could relate to these. Patricia Polacco has many other books that talk about her learning disability and inspirational people in her lives. Hope you learned something new about Patricia Polacco and you get a chance to check out some of her books. Thank you.